God, thank you for the opportunity for us to all come learn more about. I pray that open our hearts, what you have to say.
All right, if you got your Bible, open to John chapter 19. Good. John chapter 19, where we'll be. Have you all ever, those of you who drive, I hope those of you who do not have driver's license have not done it. You drive somewhere and you get there and you don't remember anything about the trip. You know, it's like
you get it out of habit. It's instinctive.
Yeah, you're so on autopilot. It's like, were there any red lights? Did I run any red lights? Did I hit it? I think I would have remembered if I hit something. But we missed the entire trip. And, you're driving somewhere familiar like work. Driving somewhere familiar like church or somewhere you can always go. And it's like, I don't remember a bit of that trip. That's pretty much everywhere, right?
Yeah, I did that this morning.
Okay, yeah. And tonight, we're going to be reading, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be reading one of those passages in Scripture. And a lot of times, I don't know if you're like that, sometimes I get to a passage in Scripture, I'll be like, oh, I know this one. Let me skim it. I know this. Let me just read through it, and I'll pick back up when I get to an unfamiliar part. I'll re-engage my brain at that point. That's pretty much how I did all my reading in college. I counted it as reading if I looked at the words. Comprehension was secondary. I'm like, because they would always ask, did you do the reading? Yes. Please don't classify that any more than did you do the reading.
Don't ask me any questions.
Yeah. But yes, I read those 4 chapters you told me to read. I think I probably stretched the intent of that question. But don't do that tonight. Because, as I mentioned earlier, we're reading a passage. If you've been in church any amount of time, if you've been in Sunday school growing up at all, you know this story. You know the events that are happening. You know these, the people involved, and you know what's going on here. But God's Word is living and active, even in the familiar passages. And what does it mean it's living and active? God's Word cuts through to us. It pricks our hearts. It convicts us. It encourages us. It points us in the right direction. Even familiar passages that get happening. So tonight, familiar passage warning. Don't check out. Okay. So tonight we're going to look at the culmination of Jesus. The whole reason Jesus came to earth. The whole reason he was born and he lived and he did his ministry was not so that he didn't do all that so he could heal people. He didn't do all that so he could preach the awesome message. He didn't do all that so he could encourage people. He did that so he could die.
Fulfill what was prophesied in Genesis 3 when God said, I will put enmity between the woman, between you and the serpent, and between her seed and your seed. He will bruise your head and he will bruise your seed.
Yes, exactly. And so it's a culmination of that thing that was prophesied back in the Garden of Eden. But it's more than just fulfilled prophecy, it's the redemption of the human race is at stake here. And so that's what's going on here. And that's why this is so crucial. So we're going to look at this from 3 different angles. We're going to look at this passage from 3 different angles because John kind of lays out 3 different perspectives here for us. First of all, what happened? And this is going to be pretty familiar to you, the what happened part of it. But second, how does that match what God prophesied? Trey mentioned one of the prophecies that points to this. But John lays out some specific events that happened that are very specific fulfillments of prophecy. At the crucifixion of Jesus, these things are very specifically fulfilled. And then thirdly, the third perspective or angle we're going to look at this from is what are the spiritual implications of what these events are and the prophecies that were fulfilled. So first off, we'll look at the historical facts. Look at John chapter 19, verse 17 with me. So this is right after his trials with Pilate. This is right after the Jewish leaders are shouting, "Crucify him!" And Pilate's trying to find some way out. And Pilate declares multiple times, "This man is innocent." Then the next verse says, and he convicted him, essentially, death on the cross. So look at verse 17. So, because Pilate said he's convicted to death, they carried out the death sentence. They took Jesus, therefore, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which is in Hebrew, Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 other men, one on either side, Jesus. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, "Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews." Therefore many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests and the Jews were saying to Pilate, "Do not write King of the Jews, but that he said, 'I am King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." So let's stop there. We'll pick up, we'll read some more in a minute, but let's start looking at what happened here, the events. So he starts off talking about this place called Golgotha, the place of the skull. And the place is really important. It has a lot of significance. We don't know exactly, like, as you go out of town, we don't know quite exactly which area, because the topography of the land has changed over the years. But they know that they've got it nailed down to a couple hundred yards or so of where it probably is. There's a couple sites that are very close to one another, or very likely, of where Jesus was crucified. But here's the significance of the place. About 2,000 years before Jesus, God led Abraham take his son Isaac to make a sacrifice. And he led him from where they lived. It was about a 3 days journey. Why did God take them so far? Why didn't he just say, go around the corner? Why did he do that?
Because Abraham probably would have been arrested for trying to kill his son. And if he said, "God told me to do it," they would have dismissed him as insane.
Well, there's a bigger reason. Because God had a specific place in mind. God had a specific place in mind. So they went a 3 days journey, and God led them to where they went. They went to this place called Mount Moriah. And at that point, God said, "This is the place. I want you to leave the 2 servants here that you brought with you, and you and your son go up on the mount by yourself." That's the same mountain that we read about tonight. That's the same hill, Golgotha, where Jesus was. Listen to the account in Genesis 22, verse 14. It says, Abraham called the name of that place. So what happened? Abraham took his son up there. God said, "I want you to sacrifice your son." And he took his son up there and is willing to sacrifice him if that's what God said. But God instead provided what? A ram. God provided something, and he said, "No, don't do that. I'm providing a ram instead." And so, in response to that, look at the response of Abraham in Genesis 24. Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide." Where's Jesus crucified? In a place called "The Lord will provide." And it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord, it will be provided. That place is a place of God's provision. And it goes on a couple verses later. And interestingly enough, God says to Abraham in this conversation, says, "You have not withheld your son, your only Son. That's the same place. It's a place of privilege. That place is a specific place. Was the place God had from. So we see the place is important, but then we see he was crucified between two thieves. Different gospel accounts will tell us different information about them. But basically, you put it all together. We know they were thieves. They may have been, they were slated to be crucified the same day Barabbas was. They might have been part of the whole group that he was with. Maybe they were criminals together. Maybe they were causing a riot together. We don't know for sure, but we do know that they were guilty criminals. Jesus was the only innocent. So then the next thing we read about Pilate put an inscription on Jesus' cross. When the Romans did crucifixion, they did it in such a way to be a deterrent to crime. It was a punishment for criminals. It was a punishment to stop the people from trying to rise up against the government. They wanted to intimidate people. They wanted to have such a heavy hand that people were scared to revolt or to rebel in any way. And part of what they would do is they would say, this person is guilty of these things, and they would take the list of their offenses and put it on the cross with them. So as you walk by and you see someone dying a horrible death, you would also see the crimes they committed and say, ooh, I don't ever want to be caught revolting against the Roman government. I don't ever want to be caught doing the crime that they did, because that does not end well. But because Jesus was guilty of nothing, they put Jesus Nazarene. Pilate kind of did that in a way to stick it to the Jews, because as we talked over the last couple of weeks, Pilate and the Jews had this contentious relationship, and Pilate, there was no love lost there, it's said. And so Pilate has this opportunity. Look at how despicable these Jews are. We're crucifying their king in a horrible way.
You don't think you might have put that might have been put on sarcastically as in King of the Jews?
Yeah, exactly. And then the Jews are like, wait, do not label him as our king, because we don't see him as our king. We just told you we have no king but Caesar. And he's like, you want it off there? I'm more determined now to leave it on there. What I've written, he said. I'm leaving it. You're not changing it. That's what's going on this cross. King of the Jews. Interestingly enough, this is, again, during Passover season. So the population of Jerusalem swells by about tenfold, probably from 80 to 100,000 or something like that, to over 1 million people in Jerusalem during Passover. He wrote it in 3 different languages, so that it was the language of the Jews. Aramaic was the language of the Jewish people. He wrote it in where the other one?
Greek,
Latin was the legal language. Greek was the language of the common people. Kind of a worldwide language. And so, interestingly, what Pilate's doing is essentially writing the first gospel tracts here unintentionally, because he's identifying Jesus as the King of the Jews, as the one sent by God to be the King of the Jews. Remember back at Jesus' birth, the wise men came from the east, and they went to Herod, and they said, we're looking for him who was born King of the Jews. That's who we're looking for. So essentially, Pilate's putting this up there and declaring who Jesus is in an accurate manner for the whole world to see, that the whole world that's in Jerusalem at that time. Let's jump down to verse 23 of John. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his outer garments and made 4 parts, a part for every soldier, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless and woven in one piece. So they said to one another, let's not tear it, but let's cast lots for it to decide whose it shall be. This was to fulfill the scripture, they divided my outer garment, and for my clothing they cast lots. 5. Therefore the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary, wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. From that hour, the disciple took his own. So this section tells us a couple more historical events that took place. The soldiers divided Jesus' garments. We looked at the implications of that a little bit last week, but it was customary. It was kind of, hey, here's the spoils of what you're doing. Okay, you're going to all this extra effort. You get to divide up the convicted man's clothing. Okay, so that's what they're doing, and that was a common thing. That's just what they did. And as it notes here, they didn't want to divide up and cut up a garment that was made in one piece and had some value, and so they gambled for it. But then we go from that. So they're doing this at the cross. They're doing that with Jesus' clothes, just dividing them up like he's a non-entity. And the callousness and coldness of that to the tender care that we see in Jesus for his mother. Tells us there were 4 women there, 3 of them named Mary. Okay, it's kind of like Ashley was a couple years ago, or whatever. Yeah, it's like Mary's everywhere. And 3 of them were named Mary, but one of the Marys was Jesus' mother. John was also standing nearby. These 4 women are people whose lives were impacted by Jesus' ministry. They were there because of their devotion. They were there to express their devotion, love, and support for Jesus. John, as I mentioned, was also nearby, and Jesus said to him, John, take care of my mother. I want to put her position now. So let's keep reading on as we look at some of the historical factors here. Verse 28. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things had already been accomplished, filled the scripture, said, I am thirsty. A jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of the sour wine upon a branch of hyssop and brought it up to his mouth. Therefore, Jesus had received the sour wine and said, It is finished. He bowed his head. He left the spirit. For the last event here, the last part of the historical events that took place is that Jesus essentially lays down his life here. We see the fact that Jesus had physical thirst. He was fully God and fully man. And as a man, he was thirsty.
Think of all he had previously gone for. He had been scourged, God knows how many times. He had to lift it. I have no idea how heavy the crossbar, and if he fell over, it would have caused serious damage. Would have had nails the size of T-Rex teeth driven into his hand to hold him up on the cross, combined with the fact that it was placed right on the vein.
What is it?
T-Rex. Well, they would have had to have been large enough to hold a grown man on the cross, because contrary to popular belief, Jesus was most likely not as scrawny as he's portrayed, because it's worth noting that he was a carpenter, and back in those days, without power tools, you would have needed someone who had very hard and taut muscles and strong and calloused hands. So Jesus was most likely reasonably average in terms of body size. So what did they would have, the
You're
nails
not
would
gonna
have
get
had
into it.
I still haven't answered the question.
Very low.
She was asking how big the bricks.
Thank you.
Big. Big. Yeah. Okay. So we see his humanity here. I thirst. Okay? From a human perspective, we get that, right? From a human perspective, yeah, it makes perfect sense because of all he's done. Because of the, the blood loss he had, because of the excruciating
exposure and dehydration.
Yeah, dehydration that would have taken place because of just the fact that he had been up all night, being shuffled back and forth, trial to trial to trial. I thirst. But then his last statement that John reports is, "It is finished." And then it says, he said that, and then gave up his spirit. So the historical facts here, probably y'all knew most of what we just talked about. Y'all know the historical facts. But they give the context for some deeper things going on. But we have to make sure we understand the facts to understand how the prophecies were fulfilled, what the spiritual implications are. So we start with those facts, and we will move forward. The only remedy for the spiritual need of man, for sin, for our lostness, for our rebellion against God, was the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. That was the only remedy. That was the only solution. And as we kind of hinted at, this was God's design and plan all along. God didn't get to a point and he's like, oh, here, what have we done? We're in a pickle now. Figure out a plan. No, God's plan from the beginning was the plan that he executed here as we go through the Gospels. And the prophecies that are fulfilled in these events just strengthen our faith. So let's look at some of the prophetic fulfillments specific to John. We got some of the, Ray mentioned one earlier about Jesus' death on the cross, fulfilling the prophecy in Genesis. But let's look at a few of the specific prophecies that were from centuries earlier and were fulfilled and noted in John as being fulfillments of prophecy. So the first thing is that Jesus went willingly to the cross. Do y'all see that? They led him. They didn't shove him. They didn't drag him. They didn't take him at gunpoint. He went willingly to the cross. Look at let me read Isaiah 53, verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, a sheep that is silent for the shearer. That's how Jesus went. He went like a lamb. He went without fight. He was arrested without a fight. He went to the cross without a fight. You think of some of the obstinance of some of the criminals that they tried to crucify. How much of a fight they would put up. How much resistance they would give at being arrested, at being crucified and taking that route. But Jesus went that way because it's a fulfillment of prophecy. Next thing we see is he was crucified with two criminals. If you keep reading in Isaiah chapter 53, it says he poured himself out to death and was numbered with the transgressor. Yet he himself bore and interceded. He was numbered with the transgressors. He was nailed on a cross with those who were sinful, those who were criminals, those who deserved it. That's who he was crucified with. It tells us that he was crucified outside the city. Okay, so they led him out of town. They led him out of Jerusalem. Look at read Leviticus 16, verse 27. Instruction God gave the people of Israel back long before they entered the promised land. He said, but the bull of the sin offering and the goat of the sin offering, blood was about to be brought in to make it in the holy place. So to make atonement is to make right, to make one, and to bring things together, to reconcile. The blood was brought to make atonement in the holy place. It shall be taken outside the camp, and they shall burn their hides, their flesh, and their refuse. Be taken outside the camp, outside the city, for that purpose. Another one is that Jesus was lifted up on the cross. Many forms of execution don't involve lifting someone up. This is why the Jews couldn't put Jesus to death, because their form of execution was stoning someone. To stone someone, to throw them down on the ground, and you hurl rocks at them until they die. Okay, that's basically it in a nutshell. There are very few forms of execution that involve lifting up the one who's executed. The crucifixion was that. Look at Numbers 21. You read verse 8 and 9 for you. Israelites had been disobedient to what God had done. And he sent poisonous snakes into their midst so that they would turn back to God. And he gave them a remedy. There's only one remedy if you've been bitten by the snake. And here's the remedy. The Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a standard, put it on a pole, and it shall come about that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, he will live. And Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a standard. And it came about that if the serpent bit any man, when he looked to the bronze serpent, he lived. Now look back at John chapter. John 3:14, yeah. There it is. John 3:14. Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and he refers to his own death. And he says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, the one thing that could save the Israelites, just like Moses lifted that serpent up and put it up there, so people had one point to turn to for salvation, so must the Son of Man lift it up. So one last one. And John kind of talks about it as he gives his account here. But the fact that the soldiers divided clothing, that's talked about in Psalm 22. They divided my garments and for my clothing. Psalm 22 includes a lot of prophecies about Jesus, about his life and death. Crucifixion of Jesus, as I mentioned, didn't catch God. This was God's plan all along. He prophesied it. He gave this word to prophets from years back. It wasn't a case of evil men thwarting God's plan, evil men kind of sabotaging what God had in mind. This was exactly God's plan all along. It happened just God said it would happen. But as we look at it, we need to make sure we understand that the death of Jesus was more than a historical fact. And it was more than just the fulfillment of prophecies. Because it's not like God's going to make a prediction and then make it come to pass. There was something more going on here. And so let's look at the theological, spiritual significance of this. What are the implications in our lives of this fast? It's interesting that none of the Gospels, and I think we tend to do this in our society, none of the Gospels focus on the physical suffering that Jesus suffered. They talk about it and they allude to it, but they don't dwell on it. That's not the point. It's not the part they highlight. I think there are two reasons for that. One, you mentioned crucifixion to the original audience of any of the gospel writers. They knew exactly what you were talking about, and they knew how gruesome it was. They knew how horrible it was. But the second reason I think it's not not highlighted is because of physical suffering of Jesus. That's not focused. The cross is a lot more than the suffering and death of an innocent man. He was guilty of no crime. There was no reason he should be crucified. It's easy to focus on, kind of start digging into how gruesome it was, how painful it must have been, how demeaning it was, and all the physical aspects of it. And yes, it was all that. That's true. But we can't get into the perspective of thinking this was just a moral wrong done. Now, this was God's plan all along. It was the plan, the spiritual implication. No one's ever going to be, there will be no one you meet in heaven who's there because they had pity, justice. No one will be there because they felt so bad that Jesus went through that suffering. The only reason anyone will be in heaven is because they said Jesus is the one who died for my sin. He's the one that took my place. He's the one that paid my penalty. No one will be in heaven. The agony Jesus faced was more than physical. That's why the gospel writers focus on it. The agony Jesus faced was on a spiritual aspect. Jesus knew it was God's will, and he talks about this. God talks about this in Isaiah 53. It's God's will to crush him and to allow him to be pierced for our transgression and wounded for our healing. By his stripes we're healed, and the difficulty that comes with that. But the difficulty that Jesus faced and the anguish that he faced was most related to spiritual. He said, Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. He wasn't just talking about, please make this easy. Or can you give me some Advil for the pain? Can you give me, can I have something to deaden the pain? He's talking about the spiritual faith. Cross is the perfect Son of God, paying for your sin and mine. Taking on the Jesus who had never experienced sin, taking on every sin, taking that on himself. It's him taking that and paying the penalty that you should have paid, the penalty that I should have paid for that sin, and making that right for God the Father. So he's taking on the sin. Okay, just think for a second of the sin in your life. Okay, so I want you to just take an inventory of the sin in your life. Putting that on one person. Someone taking and bearing it that way. Now look at all the other bumps that have probably way more sin here, right? But look at everybody in the room. Everybody, we all have a long list of things that just immediately pop into our mind. But he took the lead. Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass. This is a faith. Jesus is focused on the spiritual aspect. The gospel writer is focused on the spiritual aspect. What happened when Jesus was crucified? The barrier between God and man was torn down. Previously, people had to approach God through a priest. They had to approach God on certain terms, on certain days, under certain circumstances. And now, because of the sacrifice of Jesus, the Bible tells us that the veil in the temple that separated regular people from the presence of God, that was torn in half from top to bottom, signifying all people have direct access to God. You can now approach God, and God says, you don't have to approach me timidly. You can boldly approach my because Jesus sacrificed. Because Jesus died on the cross, the daily animal sacrifice, the annual sacrifices that they would make, they were obsolete. There was no need for those. Because Jesus died on the cross, the holiness, the justice of God satisfied. Verse 30 says, Jesus said, it is finished. He bowed his head, gave up his spirit. It is finished is Jesus' declaration. These are words of victory. This isn't a defeat. Oh, I'm done. I quit. I'm tapping out. No. It is finished. It says he yelled out in a loud voice. He cried out in a loud voice. It is finished. What's finished? What's done?
The redemption of mankind.
Exactly. So let's look at it. Let's break it down a little bit. The penalty for sin has been paid once for all. These verses point to those truths. What else has happened? So the penalty of sin has now been paid for all mankind for all time. But secondly, Satan is defeated. Through the death of Jesus on the cross, Satan is defeated. Thirdly, God's righteousness and God's wrath are fully satisfied. Through the death of Jesus, we can now meet God's crazy expectation that we are holy as He is holy. We can meet God's impossible expectation of us as humans that we are righteous in His standard. We meet the expectation that there is now no condemnation for us because God's justice has been satisfied. God has nothing against us because Jesus wiped it all out. When Jesus said, it is finished, that's what He was saying. He was saying, you know what else is finished? Every prophecy relating to redemption has been fulfilled. What God promised has happened. It's finished. What else is finished? As Trey mentioned, the redemption of mankind is complete. It is finished. Nothing can be added. Nothing will ever need to be added to what Jesus has just done. Right before He said, it is finished. He gave up His Spirit. In that word, in that phrase, it is finished, in the Bible, in the original language, it's one word. Tetelestai. Tetelestai. And that's actually a word that if you go back into old documents from Jesus' day, if you go into a shopkeeper's, if you were alive in Jesus' day and you went to a shopkeeper's place and you look through his business records, he would show how much Matt owes me for this pot that I made him, this thing that I made him. And so he owes me this much, but he paid it all off. I'm going to stamp that. Tetelestai, paid in full. He owes me nothing anymore. It means paid in full. It's actually a transactional term that means the debt is fully paid. Jesus is saying the debt of mankind's sin fully paid. What happened next? Jesus said, it is finished. What's the last part of that verse? He gave up. Highlighted this multiple times over the last couple of weeks. No one put Jesus' life from him. John and 18. Jesus lay down. Because he fully paid for our sin, forgiveness is available. We can be restored to a right relationship with God. We can have that fellowship directly with God. The forgiveness of God is available to everyone because of Jesus' sacrifice. One of the most significant things about following is this concept of forgiveness. Freedom that comes with forgiveness for those of us, Jesus. I was told you previously, I read a book that took about 8 months to read it. I had a hard time getting through it. But once I got going in it, it was okay. But it was about this guy who grew up in a very devout Hindu family. And the story is his conversion to Christianity. His conversion and his understanding of the need for a relationship with Jesus Christ and coming out of that life. And here's the interesting thing that relates to what we're talking about tonight. In Hinduism, there is no concept, not even a term, for the concept of forgiveness. That's not even a thought process that happened. And so as this guy came to Christ, he had to learn this new concept that he'd never heard before. There's no concept of forgiveness in Hinduism because the concept they've replaced it with is this concept that you've heard of called karma. What does karma mean? Pay for everything. You pay for everything. Anything you do wrong, you're going to get back. Multifold. Either in this life, or they believe in reincarnation. Or in the next life. Your next life will be horrible. You're going to be a roach next time you come back for the bad. But you will pay for it. There is no concept of forgiveness. There's no idea of the slate being wiped clean. You carry everything with you, and you pay for everything that you do. Karma is not, it's kind of been popularized in our culture. It's not this fun concept that you get what's coming to you. It's a concept that removes the concept of forgiveness, replaces it. This idea that you're the only one who's paid for it. Because it takes God completely out of the equation. Because of Jesus, there is no pain. Because of Jesus, there is forgiveness. Because there is no karma. There is no payment for everything you do. Jesus takes it, and He paid for it. That's what He carried on the cross, and that's what He said. I paid for that. That sin that you're carrying with you, I paid for that. Palestine, paid in full. It is finished. There's another account of Jesus' crucifixion. Let me read this for you. 23:39. One of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other answered, rebuking him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he was saying, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly, I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. Jesus returning. One hurling insults, but the other saw something. He said, Jesus, I trust you. There's something about you. When I was in college, after graduated, doing some additional classes and stuff, there were 4 of the guys and I got an apartment in Chicago. A couple of my roommates were from Cleveland, and their pastor, a guy named Alistair, and I learned something really cool perspective from him. And he talks about this event. He's like, that guy on the cross, when I get to heaven, I want to track that guy down. I want to find him and say, tell me about what happened. Tell me how that went. Because can you imagine this guy going to heaven? We were joking about getting to heaven and someone's there saying, why are you here? Ask this guy, what are you doing here? I have no idea. Well, I mean, why are you in heaven? Not really sure about that. I don't have a whole lot of understanding what's going on here. Let me go get my supervisor. Let's figure out what's going on here. Can you tell me what you know about the doctrine of justification? Can you tell me what what church you were a member of and what Bible studies you had? Can you tell me all the things that you've done for the Lord in your life? I don't even know how to do that. I don't know. Well, why are you here? Die in the middle. He said, I'm not here because of anything I've done. I'm not here because of any decisions I've made. I'm not here because of how I've lived my life. I'm here because that guy on the middle cross laid down his life for me. Jesus is the only way. Because Jesus said, it is finished. There's nothing else to do. There's no other way. It's finished. It was sufficient. It was perfect. That's where our faith is. First one, think about it, write down. How would you describe the significance? How would you explain the significance of the crucifixion to someone else? What was important about it? Why was it such a big deal? Because if you don't grasp that, you're not going to be able to accurately share the gospel. And if you don't grasp that, you won't have a grasp of what it looks like in your life to truly walk in the freedom of a relationship with God and the forgiveness that He offers. We need to own some of these truths. So I want to challenge you this week. Think on, ponder, consider the crucifixion of Jesus and how you describe significance. Secondly, actively thank God. Thank God that He has offered you forgiveness, that you don't have to carry the weight of everything around with you and pay for it as you go. Can you imagine if you had to pay for every sin? If there was some way to do it and you had to do it, I would be so far behind. All right, I'm almost up to first grade now. And that's if there was a way to do it, but there isn't. We can't even make a dent in it. Forgiveness at all. Jesus says also, because we've been forgiven, I want to challenge you not only to think out the forgiveness He's given you, but think out the opportunity to have forgiven others. And do it. Some of you, someone popped in your mind that talk about possible because of what Jesus does. Some of you question. We want to hold on to the guilt. We don't feel good success. Be on that cross. That's God's will. That I pray that you'll challenge and encourage. Thank you all for being